us while we had a quick lunch break. I appreciate that. We will continue to move down the agenda to item 6, review of reciprocal agreement for use of facilities with the YMCA. I think it was an unusual year, but I think what we learned too is we needed to spend some time looking at the agreement and the partnership that we had with the Y with respect to some of our usage at the Y and the Y's usage of some of our facilities. So Dr. Adley and Rich Rudel, I appreciate you organizing this information so we can talk through this, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. And we've had discussions with Jennifer, the Executive Director, down at the YMCA, and we've had this long-standing arrangement, and we have some finances here that show what the expenses for each party would be if it was charged accordingly. It's been I'll just say it's been a very supportive, positive relationship we've had with the YMCA, and we continue to have with the YMCA. That being said, we'll go through the finances of it and the logistics of it, and we'll go from there. Richard?
And I just, to back you up, Dr. Adley, I would say we appreciate the partnership with the YMCA, the longstanding partnership, and I know they appreciate the partnership with us, so thank you. And we'll continue to work through that. It's an important partnership that we want to continue. And also just, there is some history here going back to 2016 of an in-kind service agreement that was put. So Rich, you'll go through all of that.
Yep.
Thank you.
So this came up during the budget year. So in 2016, there was an in-kind agreement between the YMCA and Darien Public Schools attached, which we attached as the memo. Just indicated that the Board of Ed would be able to use the YMCA at no charge for swimming for both boys and girls, and the YMCA would be given priority time in the gymnasiums and not bill the custodial fee. The agreement in place stayed in place with the exception of last year. Due to COVID, the district did restrict all building rentals. So as a result, the YMCA could not use our facilities, though we still needed to use their facilities for swimming and gymnastics. We did pay out a total of $127,000 to the YMCA this past year. The YMCA did provide us an estimation on what they think it would be if the billing arrangement were to go forward. They estimate about $176,000 between girls swimming, boys swimming, and gymnastics. Obviously, if we need any additional lanes, those would be billed at an additional charge. If we were to bill the YMCA based on the board-approved building use rates that were approved in August, we would collect, assuming the same usage as the last normal school year, $1,000, and then custodial overtime of about $32,000. So there's really just 3 options to consider. The first is if the district wants to retain a current in-kind service agreement to have a written contract explored by both parties with renewals. Option 2 would be to notify the YMCA that the district intends to charge its group building usage fees just as other groups, or continue really with the third option, continue with the current arrangement that's been in place for a number of years.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Rudel. Any further comment, Dr. Adley?
No.
Okay. Well, I think we'll have a board discussion. I think option 3 is probably not an option. I think we would want something in place once we decide what that is. So I think it was an unusual year. I can understand the path that the YMCA went down. And I think we want to continue that partnership and that relationship in the spirit of a community. So I'll open it up to some board questions or comments around this. Mrs. Ritchie.
I'm just curious, have we presented these options to the YMCA? And if we have, what is their feedback on them?
So we've had discussions with the Executive Director. I think it's probably fair to say that the Executive Director would like to keep the same scenario that is currently we're working under. But she understands that there's going to be a differential between her expenses and our expenses. But you haven't seen this memo, if that's what you're asking now.
I guess I'm specifically asking, have they seen the different costs involved? And so are they aware if we decide
Well, let me just ask.
to charge them the impact it would have on their
They
operation?
knew that we would be charging. Rich, did you have the discussion of exactly how much? I can't remember.
They know what the actual usage fee is. They did not ask for the cumulative cost.
Okay.
They know what the per use fee is.
So they have an idea of what the hard dollar cost would be. Okay.
I did say that it'd be significantly more, but anyway, the number wasn't presented.
So to Deb's question, are they in favor of having some type of more formal agreement in place, or are they really waiting on us to kind of act?
I think they're
Take out the charges.
Yeah,
I
they're
think
waiting.
we-
They're waiting on us, Jack.
They're
They're waiting
on us
on
to-
us,
Okay,
Jack. Yeah.
all right. Any other, Mrs. McCammon?
I see in option number 1 that you're specifying a written contract. Is that the only mode, or is there a memorandum of understanding or anything that, did we explore that whether there might be different forms of documenting the agreement?
You could have a memorandum of understanding.
You could.
That would suffice.
Thank you.
Mr. Sini?
A couple comments. I think when I brought this up as a discussion item, I sent some policies along. So I think, as part of this kind of review, we should look at our policies in terms of, what is required per policy in terms of agreement. I know there was a policy. So I think that might be, a good place to start. 2, again, the partnership's awesome. My sons have all played Y ball. It's one of the most popular programs in town, and I fully realize that. I realize the strategic importance of the use of the pool and gymnastics facility. But when we talked in the last agenda, you look at a significant. Basically, what's been going on is there's been a significant subsidy that's gone to the Y, if you will, in this in-kind agreement, if you were to properly account for the expenses in which they would occur vis-a-vis, what these schools expended. Now, I think you could probably justify a decent discount because the scale of the operations within the schools, if you will. But, we're also incurring some custodial fees on top of that. And then, you look at maybe the second most popular program within the school, within the community in terms of numbers, and that would be like DY-LAX. So then you would have to think about offering them some sort of, or you not have to, you'd probably want to consider some other form of discount. So I guess what I'm struggling with is, we have policies in place for school rentals. I think, they ubiquitously were applied for the most part, other than this in-kind arrangement. So if I'm a community member paying us one rate, I'm seeing another organization get a second, much more discounted rate, I sit and scratch my head and say, why? And so I think as a board, we have to figure out, what's fair. Again, we want to maintain this strategic partnership. There's no doubt. But at the same time, we have to be cognizant that these are in effect, foregone what do you want to call revenues, I guess, Rich, that we're not collecting into our budget for school rental fees. And they're pretty significant. So I'll leave it at that.
Mrs. Ritchie?
So a thought I had was, have we explored with the Y the possibility of them assuming the custodial fees? And the other thought I had was we currently pay to use a facility down in Greenwich on Sundays for the girls' swim team. Have we explored with the Y, utilizing the Y and including that as part of our arrangement so that we no longer have to incur those fees? I'd be curious if we'd have had those discussions. If we haven't, maybe we should.
No, we haven't had those discussions. I honestly just wanted to come here for the board to present, the finances of it and consider options moving forward. So that might be one that we consider.
Well, that should be an option. Rich, do you have an understanding of the costs associated with the Greenwich?
We can pull it up.
Okay, but I think having those facts and presenting the full picture to the Y. Mrs. Achman?
So I think we're missing part of the analysis here. And I do know, I believe it was the year before I came on the board, it could have been right when I came on the board, that we went to other pools to see what our costs would be. Because short of cutting swimming, we need a pool. And the Darien Y was so significantly cheaper compared to the other pools available to us that to pay those rates would actually be putting us in the opposite position. So part of the thing is we have to decide if we're running a swimming program, we need a pool. And I think we first need to kind of commit to that and then talk about this delta. But if we were to go to market, my understanding, unless things have changed, and now that's 5 years ago, so maybe it has, that going to market for a pool would be incredibly expensive. And the board would have a different issue on its hand. So I think we first need to understand like what are our other options, because maybe we have another option than Darien wide, but if we don't, then we have to come up with the best possible arrangement for everybody, with taxpayers in mind and kids team in mind if we're running a pool. So I don't know, that I think would be helpful and informative. If we find out every other pool, and I'm being ridiculous here, is $500,000, well, that gives us a little more information here.
Yes.
Well, there's also a value to be placed on the time and commuting and students moving back and forth.
And we did. I mean, we looked at this. This isn't the first time we've looked at this. And
I'm not sure there's many options, right?
we looked at Wilton, we looked at Chelsea Piers.
Yeah,
New
but
Canaan.
just
New
distance-wise. Mrs. Stein?
So to follow up to Tara's question, I think the next logical question is, are these rates locked in for next year for the Y?
This is what they said they would charge us next year.
So that's
Okay.
the market rate.
Yeah, so then that, I mean, as long as that stays,
The one issue in terms of just pool facilities, when we were notified we were going to be charged this past year, the athletic director did look. One of the issues, not so much as pricing, was the availability, consistent
Right.
availability of lanes.
Yeah. I think the challenge would be looking at, I think we need to do a little homework outside, but the commute for the students and then availability would seem to be two of the biggest issues to tackle.
And we have a market rate set by the Y, confirmed
Yeah.
by the Y. We wouldn't want to change that by any
Yeah.
means.
well, as long as the Y isn't going to change it, to Tara's
Yeah.
point.
Any indication as to how long an agreement they would sign or how long they would commit to these rates? No. Any other thoughts or comments from a board perspective?
I like Deb's idea.
Yeah, I think if we could do, if we could do a little more analysis on the cost associated with the offsite we do at the Y, if those hours work, or whatever the facility, is it the Greenwich Y, Rich?
That's the Greenwich Boys.
Boys and Girls, Boys and Girls Club.
It's 4950.
49,500?
4,000.
Oh, okay.
You're right.
All right.
That's a good memory. And I think there's probably flexibility in terms of the girls' team when they need the pool on Sundays. So it would be up to the Y, I think, to figure out where there's a spot for them. I mean, they wouldn't want to do it in the afternoon. They'd want to do it in the mornings, but I think if you open up those discussions, that might be interesting to see where we come out on that.
So do we have the capacity to do a little bit of homework and reach out to some of where potentially the swimming could move to, just so we understand?
Certainly,
Availability and costs.
we can get the metric.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we can discuss.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
Mr.
I mean,
Senior.
I mean, once we get all that solidified, and I love the idea of consolidated services within
Yep.
town too, that would be awesome. When I say at the Y in town, then I think we then have to make the assessment of the policy and around
Yes.
accounting.
Yep.
So that'd be really awesome.
So then the other component of it would be to just pull, Mrs. Stein's going to have a busy July and August. No, the policy.
But we have
Like,
the
it just
policies in
organ-
place, so I thought that's what we were doing today. Like the policies exist, they're in place.
But that's
Right,
what I
we want to
mean. I
make
think-
sure that if we do make changes, they're consistent with our policy.
Right. I think we just need
Whatever
to,
we agree on, then we have to update our policy to match whatever agreement you all.
so can we just, let's get everyone to read and get themselves up to speed on the policy. And then we'll decide if we need any further discussion around the policy. I think that makes sense.
Sure.
Mrs. Achman?
I thought we were putting this action to it today. So does the administration have a recommendation for us? Is it that the board needs to do the homework before the conversation? But I thought we had moved this from the budget season today to,
Yeah, well,
Make
I
some
mean,
decisions.
that was the intent. If the board wants a wee bit more information, I certainly respect that and understand that part of it. But I'm also trying to respect what is the history of our relationship, long-term or otherwise. This is a real opportunity to discuss that because potentially that could impact us, right? But if it's such that times have moved on and we have to financially make some accommodations and changes, then this is kind of the scenario that we were looking at. So if there's no, if the only other thing that we need is a differential of other sites, then certainly we can get that.
Does the board think it's worthwhile getting some information about other sites? I hear what you're saying, Mrs. Ackman. I just think in hearing the conversation around the board, I think people are looking for just a little more information. So when we go down and make the decision from a financial standpoint, we kind of have all the facts. If in fact we go down the path and talk about custodial fees or overtime fees or something like that in trying to tackle the equity side of it.
No matter what
Yeah,
the other
no.
numbers come back at, I would think that there'd be value added to keeping it in our local town. But
I'm sorry, value.
Yeah,
I
but
said there'd be
but
some value added to keeping it in our local town.
Well, I think the value add is there, and the reality of it is any of those other places are going to be hard dollar charges. There's no option of a reciprocal in-kind agreement with any of those other places. So do we waste the time going and finding out that information?
So I didn't bring it up for that reason. I brought it up for our understanding of like, yes, the numbers are stark. They jump out at you on the
Yeah.
page, right? I mean, there's no denying that. However, the history that I had, and I don't know, it's 5 years ago. So that's how up to date it is that it was not beneficial for us. And you're right, based on both swim availability and pricing to get out of this deal. So if we're looking at changing this deal, I was just saying that's the piece we're missing. On the flip side, if we're going to go out and source the information, and we have swimming that begins practice in August and it's end of the mid-July, what's the date? So again, the timeline comes up. So I just kind of feel like we're starting and stopping. I just need to know where we are in space to make decisions, because we're going to have to either lock in with the Y and lanes or tell our swim team that they have an issue because they don't have a pool.
I think it makes sense to at least price out Chelsea and just make sure that what the Y is charging us is an appropriate cost. I don't know that we need to go to Wilton and the others, but
I don't think there's any place else that makes sense geographically.
no, I think Chelsea and that makes more sense than
Mr. Brown.
No, there won't be anybody, but
I think it makes sense to Ms. Herron's point to, get the comps so we have a full set of information
Yeah.
move forward. And this is where we are in the process. Admin put together a nice package. We have that. We considered it, want more information. So I don't think there's going to be a situation where the swim team doesn't have anywhere to go, or we're going to tell them in September that they're done for the season. Obviously, they'll be accommodated one way or the other. So.
Well, I guess, Rich, could you, administration, just get an email out to us so we understand the timeline of when these folks need to start using using the facility?
And just could I add on that? I think we have
Yes.
to enter into a contract with the Greenwich Boys and Girls Club any day now. So I think that's also something to
So the-
consider.
the-
It might be locked in already.
So we need to understand if we can move that, what is it, an hour or two? Or? So move that 2 hours on Sunday morning to the Y. And if that works, we'll get a quick comp on Chelsea Piers. We'll understand what the dates are that the swim team needs to start using the facility. I would ask everyone, we'll get a quick info out to everyone as to where this is from a policy standpoint, so everyone can just review it for their own information. And then this probably needs to come back to us at the next board meeting, so we can act on it. Yep. Everyone make sense?
Yep.
Just one last
Yes,
point
Mr.
with
Maroney.
this is, a point that always comes up with about swimming is that it's an off-site facility that we don't charge the athletes to swim, whereas all our other off-sites we do charge. So are we going to have this discussion year after year? Or are we going to put that to bed with this agreement as well, saying the in-kind agreement benefits the swimmers and there shouldn't be a payment? Or, because I just don't want to rehash this argument over and over. So.
I think it'd be nice to put everything to rest, wouldn't it? If we could.
Well, we sort of put it to bed 2 years ago. And now we're back.
Mr. Sini?
I would suggest we kind of separate as much as there is some. In that, if we go down the road of subsidies for off-sites, then we got to open up the whole Pandora's box there again. So if I might suggest we tackle this accounting issue and figure out what agreement makes sense. And then if we want to chase after the, or, talk about the equity issue, we can go there.
Okay. Further comments or questions?
So we should expect this at the next board meeting.
Correct, thank you. Does that make sense, Mr. Rudel, Mr. Adley?
Yeah.
Dr. Adley?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Next, Board Communications Working Group, further discussion. I apologize, I got this deck out late that the Communications Group worked on. So, oh, sorry, I got hard copies for everyone. So this has been a conversation, and we agreed to come back to the retreat to kind of talk about what we think we want to do from a communications working group, where we want this to go. There was good conversation around part of it being a component of policy. And also just, do we want it as a working group? Do we want it folded into policy? Do we want a separate communications committee? I think if we go back to our conversation this morning, I think we all have ideas and thoughts around various ideas from a communication standpoint. Again, I think this could get somewhat unwieldy, and we should think about what we want to focus on, some of it being some learnings over the last year in terms of what we want to focus on specifically, some stuff that maybe came out of the board evaluation. So I'll pause there, and Jill, Dennis, or Dave, do you want to touch base at a high level and just go through some of the thoughts that you guys have organized around this?
Sure. So the first 5 slides are the same slides that were submitted to the last meeting. There's no change there. We just kept them in for, in case people wanted to see them again. But slide number 6 identifies what we think the next steps are, or the next questions. The first is for the board just to agree to whether or not they want to proceed with additional communications work. And then if so, to decide in what form. And then we left a little space after that discussion to, so if we're to next steps. Michelle, I think, who has this slide? Do we want to do the work? If so, how do we want it done? I think there's broad consensus that we don't want it in a work group anymore for a variety of reasons. And then thirdly, we just left room for any additional discussion if people want to add content. But I think the primary goal out of today would be to have a form that is public for the work to be done. So what was sort of broadly touched on at the last meeting was either to add this work to the policy subcommittee, and if so, just taking a look at making sure that we have the right members on that committee, and defining who of the administration would support it. And then the second thing would be to actually create a separate communication subcommittee that would be focused a little bit less on the policy, although it would certainly touch on policy, and more on some of the more pragmatic issues like we talked about a little bit earlier, documenting some of the email stuff, just probably pulling together some best practices so that they're in one place and trying to figure out where they sit. Again, that would touch on policy potentially in some places, but it wouldn't have a policy function. So anyway, so the first question is, do we want to do the work? Do we want to proceed with communications? I think we came up with a goal this morning in the self-evaluation, but we hadn't done that when this deck was created. So I assume the answer is yes, but somebody holler if.
So Dave, Dennis, anything you want to add in terms of the work and the thought process you've gone through on this? No. Okay. I think thank you, Jill. One thought is, do we want to go back to and understand the policies around communication, define them from a board perspective, define them from an administration perspective, and then tie that into what some of us think or what we've talked about in terms of different things we want to do or change or look at from a communication standpoint. So that's one process. So I'll open it up to questions, thoughts, comments. Anyone? Nobody wants to communicate?
No.
Nobody wants to communicate?
I will. I actually think our policies are really clear on communication. I think what we found, and this isn't a value judgment, this statement is members would like maybe to act differently than what current policy states. And again, that's not a value judgment of whether that's good or bad. They just would like different areas, or they feel that the board needs to communicate more or better. I'm not sure that's just a better understanding of policy and board action, or if that's ongoing work. And I'm a little stuck on that. Like, is there actually work for this committee to do? Or is it just really kind of like our conversation with Patrice, understanding how boards of education communicate and coming up with new, like, we want a newsletter or we don't want to, you know, like whatever it is. That's where I get stuck. I mean, I think we can create a committee for anything. I just want the committee to be useful, since we all are on committees and it takes a lot of time. And like we were saying, we have long board meetings.
So I think in our digging, we did see that there's a variety of policy responses, and there are a variety of ways that boards do document how they communicate. The National Association of School Boards recommends that you have a high-level policy just saying you value communication. CABE has a policy specifically on social media for board members, not just employees of the board. So I think there's room to do a little bit of a policy audit just to cross-reference and see if we are today where we want the board to be. And that is work that either entity that was proposed could undertake without actually having to recommend policy. They could see if there are additional policies to look at. Beyond that, there are areas where we might just, you know, like some of these smaller projects are just more specific. They're fairly tactical and would be short-term in nature. And then, you know, we do know that in the strategic plan, there is a focus on communication, and we know at the Board of Selectmen level, there's a focus on communication. So I think it's probably valuable for some portion of the board to be thinking about communication and the various places that it touches our work. But again, there are multiple ways that it could be handled structurally.
So I think of like some of the comments from this morning, like a communication around kind of a year-end summary of our accomplishments, you know, and it's not about tooting our horn. It's about, wow, look at the hard work that's been done in the district. So, you know, but you said something, and maybe this is the way to proceed with this group. I think, do we look at a policy audit of communication, make sure everyone's on the same page? I think to your point, Mrs. Achman, of understanding what our communication policy is, how it pertains to individuals, to the board as a whole, and to the administration. And then within that, do we look at points that have come up over the last year or so that we want to tackle? Like more communication from the chair, dual communication from the chair and the superintendent. Do we want a quarterly news type communication that goes out? Do we want an end of year summary of what we've done and what we've accomplished? And some of that ties into continuing to keep the public informed and aware, continue to kind of educate the public as to roles and responsibilities. So those are some of the things that kind of pop into my head, but maybe a good place to start is just kind of an audit of communication policy. Just if you guys as a working group could organize that for everyone to just read. I mean, we can always go do it on ourselves. It's all out there, but just to keep it organized, this is our homework to do. Go do that, come back with thoughts and ideas, and then tackle some of the stuff from the evaluation too.
So the group is happy to keep working, but I will speak for the group. We would prefer to be constituted as a committee. We would be much more comfortable. So I think that would mean that we'd have to come back to the board at the next meeting and just make us official and decide, you know, probably we could use a fourth member, because a lot of our, we don't have to, but a lot of our committees have 4.
So Duke, you just brought up 2 things, and I think Jill made a really good distinction in the beginning. If there's policy work, Marge gets like policy updates from Shipman or CABE or whatever. Might it not, if we really want to make clear what this committee is doing, keep the policy side of it in policy?
Yeah.
And then the communication side, should that be the way we go, comes up with new ideas on how the board could effectively communicate. Although I will tell you, your work's a little tricky because you have to figure out what the chair can communicate and has the board taken a vote on how to do it. But maybe that's where the focus could be: new ways, new communication forums. But I don't it would be weird to have one group looking at policies without the policy committee looking at it when the policy committee is in the middle of an audit, right? Like, it just seems like duplicative work.
So the other point is, and then I'll get to Mrs. Stein, who Mr. Sini said needs to speak. She needs to speak. So something to think about as we rattled off all our accomplishments last year. Is there anything in here that we need to tackle from an emergency, need to do it now standpoint, or enough work and enough policy stuff that's going on that, again, it's about resources and it's about doing the right work and the quality work. So I'll pause there and go to Mrs. Stein. You have enough to do.
Policy is a lot to do, so the question is, should this just come under policy for now? And somebody from your committee come on policy and, we can work in tandem without creating a whole separate committee.
Right.
We're not quite sure. I don't know.
Yeah, there's no long-term work, I agree.
Can you,
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Sini.
can I suggest just pointing Ms. McCammon onto policy? Dave, you've already done the work. You're already on policy, right? So, and then they work from the policy committee, and we maybe even, and then
So-
even charge, sorry, and maybe even consider changing the name to the Policy and Communications Committee.
Yeah. So again, but go back to what are we putting on our plate in terms of work that we have to do? And is this something, let's have the conversation. I think there are valid points that have come up. There are stuff we want to tackle from a communication standpoint. Maybe there are short wins and short things that we could do to improve communication, but how much work do we want to put on everyone's plate? I think there's a broader policy kind of project or need that you all want to work on. So I think that's what we have to tackle first and foremost too.
And I would also ask Alan, what's your opinion?
Yeah.
Given, it's a structural.
Well, I mean, some of these things are
So can I just pause a second? Because I'll lose my train of thought. No. And maybe the key to all of this too is, how does what we're talking about tie into stuff that you have in the strategic plan? So let's not reinvent the wheel on stuff from a communication standpoint that I think you have inherently built into the strategic plan. And that's where maybe it makes even more sense to tackle it from a policy standpoint, because you're also going to be doing it from a strategic plan standpoint. And maybe that's a better alignment. So I'll pause there.
Go ahead.
Are you going to clarify something?
I have a thought, but go ahead. You're
Oh, okay. So we do have things in the strategic plan that, which talks about policies under the communication and enhancing these systems. So there are things that are lined up there for year 1, year 2. I'm just trying to get a wee handle, get my head around exactly what this, in order to opine on the thing in terms of like exactly what we're actually looking at here in terms of the format. I understand the purpose. Like today, you've sort of identified in self-improvement communication. So really, what's the function to do that a little bit? That's where I see it fitting, and I'm just pondering it at the moment as to how best to advise the board in terms of. I mean, the policy committee's there; they can review that. They have a member who's on the policy committee, so that would be helpful. I'm nearly thinking the things that we're saying here. Maybe I'm wrong in that part of the stand to the group, that they're the things that we mentioned this morning in many ways. I think, unless I'm missing something.
Sorry, Mr. Brown.
So I'd respond to that, Alan. I think
Sure.
you're right. We did touch on a lot of it. So when Patrice was talking about the issue of when a state mandate comes out and we have to follow the rules, it was the example she gave earlier. You obviously have a position as the admin, but we have a role to our constituents to get out that, this is what we do as a board. This is as far as we go. If you have an issue, you can come and, to public comment, but we're not going to be able to do anything about it. So you really need to petition to the state. So that would be the information we would provide as board members, which would be different than what the admin would provide. I don't know that we have any way to do that other than to make that comment in a meeting, and I don't know how that's received. So that would be something that would motivate our work, which is a little different from what you would do on the admin level, but would be something appropriate coming from us. So what's our method to do that? That's a little unclear. So it's issues like that I think we're trying to raise that came to the fore in the pandemic, and how do we do that? And I think Jill's right, a rules audit to see where this plays, but I think we've identified through what we've been through where there are some gaps, and we would like to make sure our policy and our procedures fill that.
Mr. Sini.
Yeah, and there was an instance where the 4 board members had to write a letter to the editor to clarify a vote, majority vote. And that would have been a perfect opportunity for the board chair to clarify what the vote was about. And things like that, where the administration, we have a similar voice, but it's a different voice than the administration.
So
Yeah,
let's
Mrs.
talk about that for a minute, because the board chair, and I was the chair, didn't need to clarify the vote because the vote had occurred. What happened in that case is someone in the public who had made public comment chose to put out a petition characterizing the work of other board members. They chose to then explain their vote. So I would disagree that that's actually not the board chairs. I sat in that seat and explained both the vote and the state statute several times. Those board members felt very strongly that they were being mischaracterized in the public. And they took that unusual step because it was such a mischaracterization. I'm not really sure that that was a communications issue, is that someone chose to put out a public petition against board action. And the board was pretty split on that vote. I mean, if you remember, that was fairly divisive time.
I was on the minority. I'm saying it would have been great for the board to have a voice to clarify what that voice was. And I supported that majority decision from that point on.
So arguably, I think
that
we
is
did.
a communication issue.
So from that seat, I think we did clarify it several times, and then those members can speak for themselves, but they felt like they were being maligned in the public and took the steps they did.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Well, I think,
Mrs. McKenna.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think that there are always going to be times, like it's just not the last time that's going to happen, something like that. There are times when it's appropriate for the board to have a mechanism. And I think we can talk about, saying that the board chair is a spokesperson is valuable, but we found there were so many different mediums, so many different communication channels, timeliness of communication had changed. And I think it would be valuable for this board to take the opportunity that some of those examples raised and just reflect on, how we want to do it going forward. And if the answer is we want to do it in the exact same way, that's a fine outcome. But I think this is a really good time post-crisis to reflect on what our communication looks like. And I think we've heard that from the public. We've heard it during campaign speeches. A communication plan is a fairly simple way to just take policy, and leave that fairly high level, and just create a little bit of a framework for responding.
Mrs. Ritchie.
So just to give my 2 cents, I think it makes sense to direct the policy committee to do this work and add a member if needed. And if there is more that comes out of it, we can reassess at that point. But I think at this point, it would be my view that policy should start to, I'm sorry, Katie, there seems to be a lot on your plate right now. But I do think it's the most appropriate place for that work to reside at this point in time.
Further, Mr. Maroney.
Yeah, I think the comments that, from my recollection, the original purpose of this is that we had some gaps or questions on how we communicate. And I think the goal is just that we don't, if we put it in a strategic, we put it in our goals and objectives, that's one part. But I think we also just need, to Dave's point about Wi-Fi, there was just kind of this nebulous part of where does communication sit? So do we form an ad hoc committee that, and I agree with Mrs. Hockman, this would not, I don't think this would be a committee that would sit for years, but I think maybe it would sit for 6 months to a year, and then we hash out some of these smaller projects maybe, or it could sit in the policy. To me, it's just a point that we have a place that we don't lose focus on communication and identify that we do have some opportunities to improve our communication, and how do we do that better?
No, I agree. I will, to be honest with you, it's sort of like a recurring theme. So I think we need to figure out how we're going to tackle it. I think we need to balance that with all the work that's on everyone's plate to begin with. So, my thought process is, do we look at it from a policy standpoint, add someone to the policy committee that has a focus on the communication side of it, work with Alan as he develops goals for the new year, and tie it into what some of the communication strategies are in the strategic plan. I mean, is that a thought process that's everyone comfortable with? And then, look, if there's anything that comes out of policy work other than a refresh and an understanding and an education of what our policies are, we can tackle that. We can look at what the communication is in the strategic plan. And then does any of that tie into some of the stuff that came out of the evaluation this morning? So Mrs. Ackman.
So, I mean, I think I am fine at this point. It seems like communications and policy are dovetailing so much that if you want to assign a member, Dave's on the communication committee. If you want to assign another member, Dennis or Jill. But that person, I think, is then welcome to the party this summer. We got a lot of both policy and communications work. Like, I don't think they'll just be assigned to communications. And you have a policy and communications committee. If enough work grows from that to really consider forming a committee, that might be worth looking at. But to create a whole new committee, I don't see the breadth of work at this point.
I would I think if we start where we are now, what we just decided, start there. And if out of that, it morphs into something bigger, to Dennis's point of a 6-month project or an 8-month project, then let's take it from there. But let's do the work within the policy committee by adding a member to the policy committee from a communication standpoint. But then let's also, as a board, get very clear about, and send in your comments to me, to Alan, to Katie, to Jill. Be very clear about what we're thinking about or what we're challenged with or what we want to change or do from a communication standpoint. Because then we can prioritize those. I don't know, it's bigger than a bread box, but we talk about it, but let's start to define it a little more. I don't know what that analogy was, but that's just what came out of my mouth.
I don't know what the communications.
I don't know how I got a bread box and a Mack truck out of that, but yeah. So, but we need a lighter moment every now and then, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dr.
Yeah,
Adams.
so I see.
You talk a little bit about it, all right?
I see the policy, right? The policy subcommittee, if you were just going to this policy subcommittee to do policy works somewhat, okay. The communication subcommittee, the way I'm seeing where we're landing here, if it was a separate communication subcommittee, essentially I see that as a mechanism to drive the work. That's the lens that you're taking here. If you were doing that, that would drive the thinking about looking ahead and what do we have to do, and maybe different mechanisms. But I do see that then probably when you put it with policy and subcommittee, in addition to doing the policy work, you're probably doing that too a wee bit. That's how they're driving the work. That's what I see. Or to make the effort to do that. Is that right?
Okay. Does that make sense? Kind of that direction? For now, we'll continue to evolve. How do we go about appointing someone to
You do. The chair signs.
Okay, so we will do that. Okay.
What did the define administrative support mean? I just want to make sure what that meant.
It meant if Marge is the right person to support, let's say we've ended up with policy, if Marge is the right person, but if you need to add somebody else, whether temporarily or permanently.
Okay, good.
Okay. All right, are we moving on to next topic? Town Special Education Reserve Account. I'm not sure it's a reserve account or a fund account. I believe Rich handed out some information. So again, just a conversation. So the Board of Finance has spent time over, I think, not the last year, maybe the last year and a half, of looking at all accounts throughout the town and doing kind of an account consolidation, looking at the process by which they reserve funds for everything from fire trucks to other types of vehicles and assets throughout the town. So I'm trying to think, Rich, let me just find me. No, I got it right here. Thanks. I put it in the wrong pile. So this was created, this special education account was created in 2010, Rich? Correct. And there's been, for $100,000, and some folks on the board will help me here, came out of the challenges with special ed, and there was a creation of this account if there were any costs that were associated with special ed as we work through those challenges. So, Rich, when you say there's been no activity since 2011, what does that mean? Activity other than the account being set up and funded?
So it was funded in 2010, and then no withdrawals from that account have been made since 2011.
Okay, all right. So the discussion before us is, do we want to align with what the Board of Finance has been doing and kind of consolidating all these reserve accounts, fund accounts, accounts that they use, as I said, to allocate money for trucks and stuff like that, and put these monies back in the general fund. So that's the conversation. Mr. Sini.
Yeah, just a question. In terms of us, the Board of Ed and the administration accessing a fund, what's the process?
Yeah.
And is it different than any other general appropriation that we would seek from
No.
the Board of
So,
Finance?
in speaking with the town, it's the same process as a special appropriation. It's just specifically designated for special education or an excess cost shortfall. So you couldn't use it for facilities or things like that. It would just have to specifically be for special education.
So in that process is go to the Board of Finance, get approval there,
And then the
and
RTM.
then the RTM.
Correct.
Okay. So it doesn't make anything easier per se from a process standpoint.
No, that's my understanding, and talking to the Board of Finance and Rich and talking to Jen Tarnowski, it's kind of the appropriation process. And again, it's $100,000 done back in 2010. And, we've been through the appropriation process this year. But also if we're running a surplus, your normal accounting, that surplus would go to any special ed needs that there would be before we would go for an appropriation anyhow.
Correct.
So it's kind of money that's been hanging out there. And, as I said, the town is just trying to clean up a little bit from accounting standpoint. So I'll pause there. Mrs. Achman.
So this is prior to what the town went through with its kind of what we call the special education crisis. The one difference is it is set up, and so if the town all of a sudden needed to spend all of its money on a project, it could not touch this $100,000 because it's always there for special ed. So that's why it's in a separate account. It might not be worth it now. I'm just trying to understand what's our role in this decision. We don't govern this money. We don't govern this account. Are we just opining on whether we'd like them to keep it or not? Because I don't understand our role today.
Yeah, it's my understanding the Board of Finance would like us to agree that we're not going to use this, or we don't need it right now, and that
okay.
it can just go back to the normal general fund. Like 10 years later, 11 years later, why is it still hanging out there? So just an agreement that we have the normal appropriation process, so there's no reason to keep a $100,000 account out there from an accounting standpoint. Mr. Brown.
Just to share my opinion to help develop the sense of the board, I would support returning this to the general
Yep.
fund.
Mrs. Ritchie.
I wanted to first get a little bit of a history. I don't remember way back when. Do you know, Rich, where the fund balance started and how much was used? It's never been used at all.
No.
Yeah, so from what Janet indicated to me, it was done through a transfer from the general fund to create a committed account for special education. And there's been no activity in about a decade.
So so it's never been used
Correct.
at all. And I was also curious about the procedure, because it doesn't seem like we could say, okay, yes, release the money back, but it doesn't seem like we're part of that approval process. We're not in charge of those funds, but we would have to ask for it. But we can't decide if it should, technically, we can't decide if it should be wrapped into the general fund. That's not our decision. We're just saying.
I think what the Board of Finance is looking for, a consensus for us that we're okay if the Board of Finance continues to collapse all these reserve accounts and continue to clean up the balance sheet.
And this is being one of them.
And this being one
What
of
were
those
the
accounts.
impetus for why this was created in 2010? Like, was there something the board was?
I thought it was
tied.
tied to this special ed thing, so I'm mistaken on
Well, it
that.
was before it. It's 2010.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mrs. McCammon.
It seems to me that number is pretty small and would do very little. Yeah, okay. So either we would need to fund it in a significant way, or we should just collapse it.
Okay. All right.
What's the point on the
So,
budget?
so
I mean,
we'll,
it's-
in order to have the discussion, we had the discussion. People may want public comment on it, so we'll put it as an agenda item for the next board meeting. All right? Good.
So,
Yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I'm still confused on what we're discussing, because I don't know the impetus for the fund. I don't know,
The Board of Finance is looking for.
I know what they want.
Yeah.
I'm clear on what they want.
Okay.
I don't know the role. I don't know if we really have a role.
Yeah, I mean, that's my
The
question. too,
parents
like-
may, there are parents, there are groups who may have a role with the Board of Finance expressing their issue.
So-
I don't know that the Board of Education has a role in this unless someone tells me the Board of Education requested it be set up originally, then we have a role in it.
Okay.
I don't have the history this
Yeah.
far back.
So fair enough. So what we'll do, I think the consensus is there's no point in keeping a $100,000 account out there. So I'll confirm via the town or even Mr. Mooney, like what is our role and what does a vote signify if in fact we even have to take a vote to tell the Board of Finance, continue to clean up your reserve accounts. I mean, to the point of the conversation, we have to go through a request and appropriation process. So I'll clarify all that.
Yeah,
But
I would
just
not be
wanted
in
to-
favor of any change until I
Yep.
know the history.
Good. No, makes sense. Mr. Senior.
I mean, again, this is part of the communication between boards, and they're
Yeah.
asking for some input on
Yeah, yeah.
whether or not, if we said, no, heck, no, don't do it, I think
Right.
they'd find that valuable too.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, good.
And
Thank you.
typically, you would
Yeah.
have some sort of written something as to what these agreements.
Yeah,
or
I think
accounts would
that's,
be.
there's limited, right, Rich? There's
There's-
limited documentation, if any.
We were not able to find the minutes from 2010.
Not even in the RTM. or anything.
No.
It's
Yeah,
next
so
to
I
the-
guess what I'm wondering, and this is just me trying to put the budget conversation context in at the time, is there were a lot of budget cuts going on in this time period. And they might all have been valid. I'm not putting a value judgment on that. And what I'm trying to understand is did the Board of Education say, okay, we are going to take cuts, but we need a safeguard and this is it. And maybe in 2010, $100,000 was valuable. We
Yeah.
all know our budgets have grown.
Okay.
And if this was at the Board of Education's request, then we owe it to the Board of Finance to
Yeah.
opine. If this was at the Board of Finance's request to set this up because they were doing, they had a reason to, then in some ways we owe it to the Board of Education, the Board of Finance not to interfere and to send the parents who have questions to them. So some history.
We'll clarify that. That's good. And I don't know, Rich, did you go back through Board of Ed meetings from 2010 if they're?
So in speaking to Jen over the town, we were trying to find Board of Finance minutes or RTM minutes. At that time, everything's boxed up in the basement of Town Hall, and finding it was
And now you're going to say it's all been flooded out.
quite difficult.
Yeah, because we had minutes from 2010, but.
All
I
right,
don't know.
so look, the consensus is we don't see a need for it and the Board of Finance should continue to clean up their reserve accounts, but we'll do a little more homework before the next meeting. Good. All right. Thank you, everyone.
I don't want to just
Go ahead.
add it, but it does beg the question, if, I'm assuming the answer is no, whether you want it, because the other thing is for this account to hold you harmless for special education accounts, not defined by the money per se. I've seen that work in different places too, but the other option is to do away with it and just go for the appropriation, right? So,
Wait, explain more. Give us.
well,
For
it's maybe
overrun?
it's maybe not a dynamic that has shown itself here, but if you have a deficit in deficit in the general budget, primarily due to special education, it's not inconceivable that the Board of Finance could hold you harmless for that amount of money, and it's articulated as such, even though you still have to go and get it appropriated. So that perhaps maybe was the intent type of thing, because that exists in different places.
I'd be interested.
All right, so we'll see what we can find out about that. All right, good. Thank you. Okay. Discussion and possible action on the renewal of the superintendent's contract. So we sent this out electronically. So it is that time of year to renew the superintendent's contract.
Oh, sorry. We don't have a black line version though.
Nothing really changed.
Okay, as
I
long
went
as-
over
yeah.
that with Mr. Mooney.
Okay.
Nothing really changed. Nothing changed other than the dates and the dollar amount. He actually said it wouldn't be worth the time to do a red line or black line agreement. Yes. So we are extending the superintendent's agreement an additional year to continue with the 3-year contract through June 30th of 2024. Deb and I sat with the superintendent yesterday from a review standpoint and had a very positive meeting. And the board also decided on a 3.5% salary increase for the superintendent. So any questions or comments? Yes, Mrs. McKenna.
You probably are going to say this, but thank you, Alan. This wasn't a crazy year. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Thank you, Dr. Adley, and for your cabinet and the administration. It's probably never enough thanks to go around for everything that we went through over this last year. So we're excited to have you on board and continue to have you on board.
Thank you.
Motion to approve the superintendent's contract. Mr. Brown, second by Mrs. Stein. All in favor? That is unanimous.
Thank you. Thank you for the board support. The 2 years have literally flown by. As I've said many times, the superintendent doesn't do anything without its staff, and I have a phenomenal staff here at Central Services, and also the teaching staff and the support staff. So we're blessed all the way around, and I look forward to continuing to work with the board and the community. It continues to be an honor and privilege to lead the district. So thank you.
Thank you. Great. Moving along, discussion and possible action on charge to Hinley Homes and Royal Building Committee. Part of the goal here is, after meeting with the First Selectman Office, was just to define that we are going for one building committee for all schools. There will be individuals represented by all schools on the overall building committee project. And then I believe, Dr. Adley, you also spoke and confirmed with the state that one building committee is fine for these three projects.
That is correct. Yes.
Okay. That was a question that came up. So any questions or comments on the Hinley Homes and Royal Building Committee and the renovations for those schools? Mr.
Do
Sini.
you know what the time frame is going to be for the formation?
We will get this over to the selectmen, this week. So if they can get it on their agenda, and then hopefully sometime over the summer, Jamie will organize that building committee. So we had a great meeting we had a great presentation at the First Selectman's office, and I think everyone's on board with, we want to keep this moving and move it as fast as forward as possible. So may I have a motion to the proposed charge of responsibilities for the 2021 Hinley Homes Royal School Building Committee? Mr. Brown, second by Mr. Maroney. All in favor? That is unanimous. Thank you. Anything else I need there, Jill?
I think technically you're supposed to read the resolution into the minutes. You could waive the reading.
Do I have a motion to waive the reading?
Yes.
Mr. Sini,
So
second by
moved.
Mrs. Achman. All in favor? That is unanimous. I think we all understand the scope of the project, and we're just going and just clarifying from multiple building committees to one building committee. Good. All right. Dr. Adley, discussion and any update around the American Rescue Act?
So there's no change here. I just flag it just because it's sort of the last, the last opportunity, but at this point with the personnel that's in there, we have to go hire people, and I just want the last sort of flyby that that's the direction we're going at this point, unless otherwise indicated. Nothing has changed in terms of the expenditures.
Comments, thoughts on the American Rescue Act? Is there anything, Dr. Adley, that you're moving on, working on over the next couple of months? I guess with respect to the hiring, and just kind of a quick update as to how that's going.
Well, we haven't, again, this is why we have not hired or advertised for these particular positions. So we got to get on the stick with that. So that's the main reason.
Okay. Mrs. Ritchie.
I'm sorry to remind me the timing of once we put in the outline of what the costs are, when we would anticipate receiving the funds for the grant.
So it's due August 16th. And then once it's approved, we would do monthly drawdowns similar to any other grant. So we probably would be able to do drawdowns in October.
Mrs. Achman.
So I know that we can alter the plan every 6 months, but I'm assuming with the 3.5 FTE located in here, we would hire for the year. So really,
Yes.
you're not adjusting that.
Oh, right, correct.
Within the 6 months. And then we are looking at, I know we discussed as a board, anticipating recovery $50,000 in recovering services based on the PPTs this spring.
That's correct.
So that's not going to change. I mean, it
But
has
yeah,
some
yeah, yeah.
flexibility, but that's our professionals are estimating that. So really, the only thing that we could update based on experience would be to expand ruler. So we're pretty set. Like I know, but we're set.
Yeah. Yes, we are.
Okay, just clarifying.
And is there anything else? Anything else we're seeing? I see Shirley Klein has joined us. Welcome, Shirley. Always good to see you on Zoom. Is there any additional updates around any of the recovery services or anything like that?
Not
you
as,
wanted
not
to
as
get
we
to?
see them, but
Okay.
I'll ask Shirley if she wants to.
Anything you wanted to add to that, Mrs. Klein?
Thank you, and hello, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Denny.
I
No,
think you're
we're-
still on mute,
Oh, I am. I am.
or Jeff needs to take you off mute.
Right.
Shirley Klein.
Okay.
Well-
Still can't hear you.
I'm on mute.
Shirley signing for us.
Yes, I am. I am.
Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you. Welcome.
She really
I am.
While we wait for Mrs.
Yes,
Klein,
sorry,
can I just
Mrs.
ask one
Ockman.
question? And I'm sorry if I missed this the last go around. So we put the COVID compliance officer, which we had in our operating budget, which we flagged as a known expense, now in the federal grant.
Yes. The COVID compliance officer, yes, we put that in here.
Jeff, are we good on hearing Mrs. Klein?
I'll try again. Mr.
Okay.
Now? Not yet.
Yes,
Oh, great.
Thank
Well,
Klein.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Just an update. We're looking again at, as we go through ESY, we have a robust program this summer. We have all of our additional recoup and recovery systems in place right now. And we're also looking as we plan for, to Ms. Saka's question, for the fall as well. We are anticipating that the help we'll have also from the additional psychologist in the high school will help to support many of our learners at DHS. So we're going to use our time in ESY to not only confirm, but also revisit any other additional recovery services for our students, both at Tokenique and at the high school.
Great, thank you.
Thank
Any
you.
questions for Mrs. Klein? Mrs. Ritchie?
So just following on that, so the board could expect an update after the ESY program has completed and you've been able to assess to get a better, more clear picture of where students are and what additional recovery services may be needed?
We'd be glad to do that. Richie, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mrs. Ritchie. Good. Any other questions around Americans Recovery Act? Good. Thank you, Mrs. Klein. Is it my understanding you're on vacation and you're joining us?
We're in a family vacation in the mountains in Pennsylvania. Enjoy.
Nice. Well,
enjoy the rain.
thank you for taking the time and please enjoy your vacation and sign off.
Thank you. I will.
Good. All right, we will move, Michelle, to public comment.
If you would like to speak during public comment, please click the participant's icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. When it is your turn to speak, the facilitator will identify you and announce that you are unmuted for public comment. Once recognized and unmuted, please state your name and address. You will have up to 3 minutes to comment. Ms. Joanna Walsh,
Michelle, give me just a second. So I want to apologize. We got some text, and I guess there was some issue with the speakers and hearing at the initial public comment. So I apologize for that. So we're here to listen to any and all public comment. So thank you for your patience.
Ms. Joanna Walsh, you are unmuted and recognized.
Good afternoon. My name is Joanna Walsh and I live at 17 Pleasant Street. I am a co-chair of CDSP, and we would just like to thank everyone for coming together today, doing the hard work of self-reflection, especially after an exceptional school year. And we look forward to future conversations about student activities, student reps on the board, facilities, everything that you guys are working hard on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Walsh. Appreciate it.
There are no more raised hands at this time.
Okay. Give them a second. Just confirm that. No more raised hands.
No, Mr. Denny.
Okay. We see a lot of people online, so think, who is? Oh, Dr. Adams.
Okay.
Is your hand up?
Not, that's not.
Oh, okay, good. Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you for taking the time. I think we did it maybe in record time, but I think it was a good conversation. There was a a lot of good conversation amongst board members, and it was great doing the self-evaluation. Thank you, Dr. Adley. Thank you, Marge, Rich, Chris, and Shirley for all the hard work behind the scenes to organize and put something like this together. And I hope everyone's enjoying a little downtime over the summer. Although Marge informed me at lunch, this is her busiest time of year, which we can all appreciate with the hiring. And I'm sure it's equally true for Mr. Tranberg and Mr. Rudel also. But thank you for all that you do. But please get some downtime over the summer. Thank you, board, for, as always, a really good conversation about everything. And we'll continue to follow up. So Deb's reminding me to move along the motion to adjourn. So Mr. Sini, second by Mr. Maroney. All those in favor? That is unanimous.